from wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this event, which is on women's land rights as a critical pillar for climate action. And thanks very much for joining us. My name is Harold Liversage, and I work for IFAD as a land tenure specialist based in Rome. Unfortunately, we are still waiting for others to arrive, but hopefully as they come, I will introduce them. But with us today, we will have Ms. Joinsa Puri, who's the Associate Vice President of the Strategy and Knowledge Department in IFAD. And online, we have João Montalvo, who's the Senior Economist and Thematic Leader for the Africa Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. We will also have online Ms. Shirina Tabassum, the Country Director for Maldives and Sri Lanka, and Officer in Charge for Bangladesh at IFAD. We also have Ms. Emily Gallagher, the Rural Development Specialist on Value Chains, Finance and Investment at the Center for International Forestry Research, otherwise known as CIFOR. We also have Ms. Esther Mwiru, who is the Global Women's Land Rights Manager for the International Land Coalition. Unfortunately, Esther could not join us physically here today. And they will make up our panel for this discussion today. The session will last 1.5 hours. And as the title suggests, the main purpose of the session is to explore the importance of women's land rights as a critical pillar for climate action. And the emphasis of the event is on identifying concrete actions that can be supported for strengthening women's land rights going forward. We will start the session with a keynote speech by João on the evidence that they have found, that the World Bank has found on the importance of women's land rights to strengthen climate resilience. After that, hopefully if Jo has joined us, she will say a few words on why women's land rights is important for IFAD. We will then show a brief video on the experience from Bangladesh of an IFAD-supported project in Bangladesh. And we will launch a Mentimeter, where we will ask the audience for ideas on what you think should happen for actions that we could take in supporting women's land rights in the next year. After this, I will be asking the panelists a few questions, and then we will open up to the audience for you to ask questions. This will be done with the audience in the room. You can either do it on Vivox, and I think the details will be provided on that. And also, if you are joining by Zoom, you can ask the questions through Q&A on Zoom. Once we've asked questions, a round of questions, we'll give the panelists an opportunity to say a few concluding remarks. Before we ask João to do his presentation, I'd like to say a few general words about the importance of tenure security for IFAD's investments. We recognize that tenure security is a key ingredient for rural transformation and social inclusion. Most of our projects incorporate some sort of measures for securing land rights. Sometimes the investments are quite modest compared to the overall investments, but we know that they are essential. Sometimes we don't adequately address tenure security issues, and we've seen the negative impact it can have on our project outcomes. We are also a strong supporter of the voluntary guidelines of the governance of tenure, which were jointly developed by the FAO and other partners. And we are an active member of the Global Donor Working Group on Land, as well as the International Land Coalition. And many of our panelists are also members of either the Global Donor Working Group on Land or the International Land Coalition, or both. Specifically with regard to women's land rights, IFAD has consistently promoted rural women's land rights since we were formed more than 4 decades ago. Our support takes various forms, from supporting policy and legislative reforms that recognize women's land rights, including inheritance rights, to facilitating household and community level actions for transforming gender norms and improving women's access to land, to helping women register their land rights, to legal support for enabling women to protect their lands. Where we have been successful, we have seen a significant positive impact on projects outcomes. So for us, this is an important topic, and I'm honored to be moderating this event. We look forward to the insights that our panelists will give, and also the insights that the audience will give, and we look forward to a vibrant discussion. And those are my opening words. So again, welcome to all of you here and online. And with that, I will hand over to João to give his keynote speech. João, I hope you are there. I see you are. So over to you, João.
Thanks so much, Harold. Dave, could you please project my slides? Thank you. Thanks so much, Harold. I want to start by thanking IFAD and all the partners involved for organizing this important event and inviting me to be the keynote speaker. I am honored to be here. So let me start my presentation. Next slide, please. Let me start my presentation with a question. Why could stronger land rights help the environment? Here are three possible mechanisms in theory. First, stronger land rights can increase a farmer's incentive to invest in their land, boosting agricultural yields, which in turn can reduce the need to clear additional land for farming. A second potential reason is a farmer who fears losing their land might inefficiently allocate too much labor and other resources to farming as a strategy to guard their land against potential expropriation. A third reason is that a farmer who expects to farm their land for a longer period of time might be more willing to adopt sustainable agricultural practices. But particularly important for us today is my second question. Can these potential environmental impacts of land tenure security differ by gender? And in theory, the answer is also yes. As you know, in much of Africa, land rights are governed by customary tenure systems, which tend to favor men, granting rights to women primarily through a husband or a male relative. These deep-rooted customs and social norms lead to gender gaps in land rights, where women's rights are substantially more tenuous than those of men. We can thus conjecture that both the economic and environmental impacts of secure and well-defined land rights might be particularly strong for women. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, what does the evidence say? At the World Bank Africa Gender Innovation Lab, where I work, we've been conducting rigorous impact evaluations of land registration programs in sub-Saharan Africa to help answer questions like these and increase use of evidence in policy. In today's presentation, I will review the evidence on the environmental and gender impacts of land registration programs that have been implemented in different African countries, namely Rwanda, Benin, and Ghana. I'll also focus on results from a recent study testing different strategies to increase demand for joint land titling among rural households in Uganda. Next slide, please. Let me start with a study by Daniel Ali and his co-authors examining the impact of a pilot land registration program in Rwanda. This was a low-cost participatory intervention aimed at clarifying and formally registering individuals' rights to land. It preceded the national rollout of Rwanda's land tenure regularization program. To assess impacts, the authors used a research method called regression discontinuity design, where they surveyed households lying closely on either side of the boundaries of the pilot area. What did they found? They found that this pilot program caused farmers to invest in soil conservation measures, such as bunds, terraces, and check dams. Importantly, the study found that this effect was especially pronounced for women who, prior to the intervention, suffered from high levels of tenure insecurity. Let me now talk about the study by Goldstein et al. Examining the impacts of another rural land registration program in Benin. This was the first large-scale randomized controlled trial of a land rights program. The random assignment of the program in Benin at the village level allowed the authors to circumvent issues of reverse causality commonly faced in the literature and rigorously measure the causal impacts of the program. What they found was that the program increased farmers' land tenure security, and through that led to a 23 to 43% increase in tree plantation, as well as in the cultivation of perennial crops. The results also show a substantial increase in fallowing among female farmers, which, as you know, can greatly improve soil fertility. Fallow. In response to the program, what they saw is that women, female farmers, started shifting labor and other inputs away from lands located within their village, so registered land, and towards less secure land outside the village, so unregistered lands. This result is consistent with the notion that farmers can overinvest in unsecure land in an attempt to protect it. In a follow-up study, Ren Lewis and al. Focused, next slide, please. And next slide, please. So in a follow-up study, Ren Lewis et al. Focused specifically on the impact of this program in Benin on deforestation. And they found that the program reduced tree cover loss by about 20%. They also show that the main mechanism appears to have been a reduction in the need to claim more land through clearing as a result of improved tenure security. Next slide, please. Finally, the study by Aguiar Holmes et al. On a land registration pilot in Ghana also reveals that more secure land rights can help farmers shift to non-farm economic activities with only a small reduction in agricultural production and no reduction in yields. Again, the study found that these impacts are especially large for women who see their profits from operating off-farm businesses increase considerably. So, next slide, please. So, taken together, the findings from the studies I just presented reveal that strengthening land rights can have positive impacts on the environment, especially so among women. So, an important policy question is whether we can tweak these land registration programs to further increase women's land rights. Let me now share with you results from an experiment that colleagues and I are conducting in Uganda, testing different strategies to ensure that married couples include women's names on land titles as co-owners of the land with their husbands. The experiment took place in the context of a land tenure formalization intervention, offering smallholder farmers in Uganda freehold land titles for free. We specifically tested 3 alternative strategies to increase demand for joint title. Next slide, please. One possible strategy is to ensure that women participated in the decision-making process so that they could affect household land titling decisions in a way that better reflects their preferences. To investigate this, what we did was we varied whether the land title intervention offering the freehold land titles was targeted to husbands alone or to both spouses together. The goal was essentially to simulate 2 alternative household decision-making environments. On one hand, when we were targeting the husbands alone, we were trying to proxy for patriarchy, where household decisions are made solely by the husband. On the other hand, we were trying to simulate a scenario where women have some decision-making power and they can, jointly with the husbands, influence the decision. Next slide, please. Another strategy on the other side of the gender divide is to work directly with men, educating and persuading them to believe that they too can gain from an improvement in their wives' land rights. To investigate these, we varied whether participants were shown a short video clip illustrating the advantages to the family of strengthening married women's land rights through joint taxing. We showed this video just before the household had to decide whether they wanted the title that we were offering to them, and if yes, which names they would like to include in the title. For example, a key message of the video was that giving strong land rights to a married woman is an instrument through which the land is kept safe for the children upon the husband's death, instead of being potentially captured by other relatives. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And yet, a third route is to take hard affirmative action. So following previous research, what we did here to test this strategy was we varied whether the land title offer was made conditional on the wife's name being added to the title or not. While easy to implement, a common concern with this strategy is that it could potentially dissuade some households from titling altogether. You see, from a man's perspective, this conditionality can generate a trade-off between an increase in land tenure security that is provided by the land title and the potential reduction in his power within the household, because we believe that owning land rights gives you power within the household. So, next slide, please. What did we find? We found that these are simple and cost-effective ways to increase demand for joint land rights. When the intervention was targeted to husbands alone, we found that almost half of them choose to put only their own name on the title as the sole owner of the land. But when exposed to the video, most of the husbands decided to also add their wife's name on the title as co-owners. In contrast, when the intervention was targeted to couples, the majority opted for a joint land title irrespective of exposure to the video. So giving women a seat at the decision-making table can make a big difference. And in line with earlier research, we also found no evidence that imposing the conditionality reduced overall demand for title. These results suggest that men, in our context, appear to be willing to trade off a reduction in their power for an increase in land tenure security provided by, in this case, a joint land title. Next slide, please. In summary, The evidence suggests that strengthening women's land rights is possible and that doing so can have important positive economic and environmental impacts. So the evidence is in. Now it is time for policy action. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Harold, over to you.
Thank you very much, João. I thought that was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for highlighting the importance of tenure security for women in terms of sustainable land management, which really is important for climate change adaptation, but also for women's social and economic empowerment. I think also very interesting on what you gave was the evidence, which I think is often something that we are challenged with. A good, robust research showing the impact on women's land rights, and also some good concrete actions, which I hope our audience took note of. I'm not going to go through them now, but I'll come back to them later. So we are now joined by Ms. Jointsa Puri, who, as I mentioned to you before, is the Associate Vice President for IFAD for the Strategy and Knowledge Department, and known to us as Joe. So Joe, over to you for a few words on the importance of the topic for IFAD.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Harold, for having me here. Ladies and gentlemen, such a pleasure for me to be here. And apologies for the lateness of the hour. It's mostly because I couldn't get NHS to recognize who I am. And imagine if women had to go through something like that just about every day of their lives, where people don't recognize that they exist, especially with respect to basic rights, right? So to mine was a minuscule microcosm experience of what women have to go through just about every day of their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, a third of the world's population lacks secure rights to lands and forests they customarily claim. In data that IFAD has looked at, when we look at financial inclusion, we know that women and men have bank accounts. Guess what? 50% of bank accounts that are held by women are zero balance bank accounts. What this essentially means is that women are not allowed to take loans or use anything that they have as collateral to take those loans. And a large part of that is driven by their lack of assets and land access. IFAD measures gender empowerment using and gender transformational empowerment using three big indicators. One is access to land, as well as income. The second is agency and leadership. And the third is equal burden of work. Yeah? And it's essentially when we've reached targets such as these that we know that transformation has occurred in terms of gender empowerment. But we know that these deficiencies in the overall land tenure system, and especially for indigenous women, get further exacerbated when you account for the fact that they just don't have access to a lot of assets. I saw the last video and I thought it was quite instructive that in a randomized experiment, when you are trying video trials, when you're trying video messaging for couples, that works versus conditionality. And the last part of the message that came through was very interesting for some policy action that we can take. It's not okay to deny what are customary traditions in a lot of communities that we work with. But what is important is that we need to build capacities and change norms of what is right. Change norms of what is right in terms of land and property rights, change norms of what is right with respect to women's rights, and how propitious as well as useful it is for communities and households and families to have women accessing those land titles and being able to use it for productive uses. Ladies and gentlemen, today you're going to be hearing, other than the ones that you have already, quite a few of these very instructive messages on what works, what doesn't, in order for us to increase and strengthen land rights amongst rural women. We're really excited today to be organizing this event with C4, the Center for International Forestry Research, World Agroforestry, or ICRAF, the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, the Alliance for Biodiversity International, and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, as well as the International Land Coalition. Together, I'm very convinced that we can address barriers to the recognition of women's land rights and support ongoing efforts to improve resilience to climate change. I'm also really excited that you will hear stories, for example, from Aisha in Bangladesh, where she and her family essentially joined an ambitious and wide-ranging project that has been supported by IFAD, where she is able to gain land rights and transform her life, as well as that of her family and of her community. I really hope this is the story for all of us. Thanks very much, Harold. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for those inspiring words. And again, I think as João highlighted, the importance of changing norms at the community level, particularly, I think, is one of the key actions that we can look at. Before we go on to the video and the experience that Joe has mentioned now, what we're going to do is launch a Mentimeter. We will do this online. I hope, because I can't see the screen, but I believe the information will pop up where you can access the Mentimeter. We're going to launch it now, and we'll look at the results at the end. And what we're going to ask you is, what actions would you like to see happening in the next year by all of us here? Joe has mentioned some of the partners I introduced them at the beginning. What can we do, these partners that are working together, but all of us, in terms of promoting women's land rights? So we're asking you the question now. You will be hearing concrete actions. João has mentioned some, Joe has mentioned some, and we will want you to listen carefully to those and then to say, what do you think we can do in terms of those actions in promoting women's land rights? Right, I think it's up. We're going to move on now to the video on the project that Joe mentioned in Bangladesh. So we're launching that.
Every year in Bangladesh, 26,000 families lose their homes, land and livelihoods to erosion. Aisha Begum is one of them. Her family lost everything when the river washed away their land in 2001.
The problem was erosion from the river. We had no home, nowhere to go.
Aisha is one of 155,000 people who live on low-lying river islands in southeast Bangladesh. Known as chars, these islands are naturally formed from layers of silt carried in rivers flowing to the Bay of Bengal. Regular flooding and rising sea levels are continuously changing the coastline, creating new chars and eroding and submerging others. Aisha's family resettled on a newly formed char, and money was illegally extorted from them to occupy a plot of land.
The salinity of the water was very high, so we couldn't drink it. There were no wells, no ponds. Life was very difficult for us, too challenging.
There was also another difficulty. They faced an uncertain future, rebuilding their lives on land which they did not own. But then, 6 years ago, she and her family joined an ambitious and wide-ranging project, involving 6 different government agencies, 4 NGOs, and with funding from the International Fund for Agricultural Development and the Government of Netherlands. This project helped them gain rights to the land and the skills and finances to develop it. With training in fisheries, crop cultivation and cattle rearing, as well as access to microfinance loans, Aisha's family were able to start investing in their farming and livestock. But these investments were at risk, while this reclaimed land remained vulnerable to floods and erosion, so major investments were made to protect it from disasters, such as the building of raised roads, embankments, drainage canals and forest plantations. Meanwhile, the land was not only being secured physically, but also legally. Surveys were carried out to chart each plot, and legal hearings were held to assign land rights to new dwellers who possessed no land. So far, 11,000 families have received their land titles, giving them an incentive to increase their own investments.
When they got the land, they feel that that is our own land, so they will have to do something for the development of their households, their families, and also to explore the potentialities of the land.
And 4 months ago, Ayesha's family received their official certificate, entitling them to full ownership of their land.
Now we have received title to the land. Now we have security.
Today, another 400 people are being presented with their land title certificates. Among them are Rima Akhtar and family, who were displaced 16 years ago. This legal document certifies that the land they occupy now belongs to both wife and husband in equal shares. And for the first time, many women have land rights.
I'm very happy that my name came first.
It has been a struggle for Rima and her husband to rebuild their lives, and they are now expecting a second child. Owning their own land, Rima says, gives them security for the future.
I am happy and delighted that our children will own this land. Their future is secured.
While 28,000 families have been helped to build new, more secure lives here, by 2050, 35 million people in the country's coastal areas are estimated to be at risk from rising sea levels. According to one of the project designers and evaluators, this kind of project can be expanded to help these vulnerable communities.
This holistic approach with interventions across a wide range of different sectors is a model for development of coastal communities and help them avoid the risks that could come about from climate change.
And now the government is planning to use this model and replicate it in other coastal chart areas, so they can help the millions of families who are at risk to adapt to a changing climate, secure their land, and build sustainable livelihoods.
Great. So that's the video. I hope you found it as inspiring as I did. I've had the good fortune of being involved in that project. I don't want to say too much because I know Tabassum is going to say something now, but I do want to say the difference between the areas that we have seen, as we saw today in this video, and the areas where the project has not gone to yet is quite stark. It's quite incredible, the difference and the impact that the project has had. But I won't say too much more than that. What I would like to do now is hand over to Ms. Sharina Tabassum, who, as I mentioned before, is the country director for Sri Lanka and Maldives, as well as the officer in charge for Bangladesh. Sharina, are you there with us now?
I am, Harold. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us. I know it's been difficult for you to connect. Your first name is Sharina, but we all know you're Tabassum, so I'm sorry, I'm going to say Tabassum. Tabassum, you've been very involved in this, in the Child Development and Settlement Project. Could you tell us a bit more about the results of the Land Titling Initiative and its experience in addressing women's land rights? And to what extent has this helped local communities in their efforts of mitigating or adapting to the effects of climate change? Over to you.
Thank you, Harold, and with pleasure. It always gives me great pleasure to talk about this wonderful project, CDSP, or Child Development and Settlement Project. And well, you know, after that fantastic video, I don't know how much more I could add, but this is one of our flagship projects in Bangladesh and also of the government, where the land rights of women and the livelihoods of people in the chore or the polar areas in the south of Bangladesh is concerned. So this very complex but successful project actually works with 6 different agencies, government agencies from 5 different ministries. And is supported by the Dutch government's branch, through which a technical assistance team is providing technical support to each of the areas this project is helping the government with, including land title. So let me jump into that subject directly and tell you why we have to work on land title issues for women. And we've heard in the presentation from the World Bank some similar initiatives in countries like Uganda. We also have land tenure issues very well covered in CDSP, whereby the land title is in equal shares in the names of the husband and the wife. So 50% for the husband, 50% of the wife. And what we have added, the added dimension in this initiative is that the wife's name appears first on the land titles, which is a big boost for the women's position in the community. We heard two women in the video, Aisha and another beneficiary. And the second beneficiary actually highlighted the fact that her name appears first on the land title. So, as you know, Harold, women living in these extremely vulnerable chore areas in Bangladesh are extremely dependent on their male counterparts and obviously are in a disadvantaged position. So women, girls, children, they're vulnerable in many ways, not having enough access to food, living in very poorly constructed houses that are often subjected to tidal inundation and at risk of cyclones, storms, and under constant threat of physical assault from land grabbers and other thugs. We also heard similar aspects in the World Bank presentation. So this, why do we have to include women, and why are women's resource rights important in building climate resilience in communities such as in the areas in the Chor? They're very critical agents of change in building resilience. In Bangladesh, they make up about half of the farm labor and contribute to between 1/4 and 1/2 of household income. And they're involved in every aspect of agriculture that we can think of: tilling the fields, post-harvest activities, growing vegetables, rearing poultry, milking cows, and whatnot. They're also responsible for household food security and nutrition. As we know that with increased income, we get better nutrition and better management of natural resources like forests. And all these, we have found that women tend to share more information with the community on their well-being, which is important for the resilience, and also they're more willing to adapt to environmental changes. In fact, if we don't support women's natural resource rights, there are many risks. For example, men tend to migrate in search of employment. Women often end up having to make the farming decisions. And but so often women are not invited to training on good climate resilient agriculture because they're not really, quote unquote, the farmers. Their husbands are recognized as the farmers. And then the women could therefore even end up practicing the wrong kind of agricultural practices. So it was important for us to make sure that both men and women were equally integrated into this project that we are implementing in the south coasts of Bangladesh. And then the project has adopted gender concepts that concentrate on ensuring participation of both sexes in all of the activities. So like its previous phases, CDSP4 that we are implementing now, has aimed to improve the position of women and girls living in the Torres. And this was both in terms of their practical needs for food, water, shelter, income and support services such as health and education, and security and position of women in their households, in wider society. How you're talking about how this has also enhanced the position of women in the communities. Now, climate resilience involves all these aspects, so it cannot be fully achieved without women's full participation. And this very important step for enhancing women's status and security was the fact that not only they were the legal owner of 50% of the land allotted to them, but also that their signature comes first on the title document. So, you know, even when the husband is going to the bank to take out a loan, he would need the written permission from the wife because she's a co-owner, equal owner of the piece of land that they are living on now. And then the results are really, really staggering. We have done many impact assessments in CDS before. This is something that we do regularly to make sure that we are capturing the results and ensuring that we fill in any gaps there may be. So 40% of the women participate in water management organizations, which is, as you can imagine, is a very important group in areas like this where there is a constant threat of salinity and lack of drinking water, access to drinking water. And then 100% of the women are participants of the tube well user group. So these are groups that would manage a tube well that is shared among 10 to 15 households, and it's managed entirely by women. And then as a result of this land title and the ownership and enhanced participation of women in the communities, made 90% of our women beneficiaries 84% of our women beneficiaries feel that their status in the household has improved significantly. And 94% feel much more secure in the community due to the tenure security. And 68% feel that their household decision-making power has greatly improved. And all this as a result of the joint land titles that have been secured for them through this project. Let me stop here, Harold, and see if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Tabassum. I have one quick follow-up question. We want to move on to the other panelists, but I just wanted to ask you, was it difficult to engage men and local leaders in addressing women's land rights in CDSP? And how did you go about it? This was one of the issues that Joao raised. Over to you.
Thank you, Harold. Sorry, my apologies. I have a mosque very close to my place and you can hear the prayers. So I hope I'm loud enough to be heard over that. And apologies to God also. Harold, that's a very important question. And I think we all know how vulnerable these families, not just the men in the family, but the entire families are in these very climatically vulnerable areas. And as you know, and many of the people with us would know, is that people living close to coastal areas that are very prone to erosion have to move and resettle at least 5 to 6 times in their lives. And this activity itself grows kind of a different kind of bonding between men and women in the family, the entire family actually, because they have to move all together. They need to work as a team. And we took advantage of this social mobilization sort of element already existing in the area. And so it was
Tabassum, can you hear me? Maybe we'll stop with that for now, and we'll come back to it later. Thank you very much, Tabassum. Thank you very much for that point. Before we move on to the next panelist, I just would like to again mention the poll, and that you are able to ask questions on Vivox and Q&A Zoom, and we will be giving the answers to that for the poll. We will have a look at the answers at the end of the session. Okay, is it on? And I think it's now on, and you can access the poll from this link here. All right, I'm going to move on to the next panelist, and that will be Emily Gallagher. And as I mentioned, Emily is working for C4 as a rural development specialist. Emily, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks for joining us, Emily. You are involved in the Global Women's Resource Rights Initiative supported by IFAD and implemented by the CGR centers, as Joe mentioned earlier. Could you tell us a bit more about the initiative and some of the lessons that are emerging? And how can rural development projects like those supported by IFAD strengthen the climate, gender, land nexus?
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you, Harold. And can we show the slide to the audience? I have one slide, please. There we are. So the Global Initiative for Securing Women's Resource Rights through Gender Transformative Approaches brings together a consortium of gender scientists from C4ECRAF, the Alliance of Biodiversity CIAT, and IFPRI to work with projects hand-selected by IFAD to enhance women's land and resource rights. There are 7 countries which have been selected as partner projects across 5 IFAD zones, where we are or will be working closely with IFAD country leads and project counterparts, shown in brown, in Colombia, the Gambia, Uganda, Ethiopia, Niger, in parentheses there, Kyrgyzstan, and Bangladesh. The countries in green will participate as learning countries. The initiative aims to innovate and integrate gender transformative approaches into IFAD rural development interventions. Our goals are to contribute to increased recognition of women's resource rights in these 7 countries, and then socialize the outcomes of the country-level pilots across all of the countries in brown and green, and then ultimately generate recommendations for IFAD's global portfolio and strategy. To answer your question about early learning and lessons, I'd like to direct your attention to the project brief, which I'm holding up here. And those in the pavilion should have a hard copy on hand, and those online can download from our project website. So this brief describes the first steps of our gender analysis, which is a social legal analysis. There is a lot here, and I'm not going to be able to answer every question about every country, but I will do my best to touch on the highlights today. So a social legal analysis is an in-depth review of legal and policy documents through a particular social lens. And in this case, we were looking at the laws, strategies, policies, and practices which have a bearing on recognition and enforcement of women's tenure rights. And so far, we have reviewed 4 countries: the Gambia, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. So why start here? Why start with this social legal analysis? In this initiative, we recognize that securing rights to land and decision-making power over land and productive resources is fundamental to achieving rural development outcomes intentioned by IFAD project funding. I'm repeating what all of the panelists have said today. With respect to the climate, land, gender nexus, which you mentioned, resource rights are an essential precondition for women to mitigate against climate shocks, to proactively respond to climate change through the IFAD initiatives embedded in these projects. Sustainable intensification, participating in irrigation schemes and inclusive agribusiness, improved pasture management, restoration, managing floodplains, and so on to build climate resilience. Forest-dependent communities and historically excluded groups like indigenous people and pastoralists, landless women, and women with insecure rights are made more vulnerable by climate change, yet more risk-averse, making it very difficult to engage them as climate champions. So we know that when women are not positioned nor empowered to benefit from climate actions, investments like IFAD's funding in these projects risk exacerbating gender inequalities, and in some cases, even displacing or dispossessing women of livelihood options. So The first step in a gender analysis approach was to characterize tenure systems over time, formal and customary, interventions and reforms, and recognizing land and resource rights, individual, joint, and collective, and gender-specific reforms. So for our big lessons, tenure arrangements are dynamic, that's not a surprise, and in some cases they have actually been very gender responsive. So Uganda, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh have explicitly recognized women's land rights within their constitutions. The Gambia has yet to do this. Land reforms that recognize women as rights holders, as individuals, joint titling. Uganda and Ethiopia have this, joint certification in Bangladesh. There's been less innovation around collective rights, which becomes quite important for the pastoral communities. There's been gender affirmative action to ensure female representation. For example, in Ethiopia and Uganda, requiring women's participation in land committees and boards, and Uganda's taken the lead on legal awareness campaigns. But still there exists this gap between de jure rights and de facto rights. So in this analysis, and you'll see it in our brief, we identify 3 types of barriers which constrain women's recognition and the enjoyment of land and resource rights. The first is legal barriers, and these are quite simply implementation gaps between what is already accepted in principle and implementation or enforcement on the ground. These are very simple things, like in Uganda, there's the existence of land tribunals for dispute resolution, but they're not functioning in practice. There's also legal systems. Here, the barrier is overlapping and sometimes conflicting legal systems, such as the case between customary tenure regimes and formal legal tenure regimes. So this is quite often the case when we have collectivized or commons lands. In Gambia, the rice field commons, very common across our systems in sub-Saharan Africa. So the third barrier then is social norms, and we've talked a lot about this today. Social norms here are specifically socially constructed norms around gender, land, and resource rights, and which are, in many of our case studies, the overriding constraint to women fully exercising their legal rights. These norms exist within institutions, communities, and households. The main example that we give here is the recognition of legal rights, but then in cases of divorce or inheritance, after a spouse has passed away, these resource rights are not recognized. So what we want to emphasize is that the transformative change that is inclusive of women must address legal, structural, and social cultural barriers to affect change in everyday and normative accepted practices. And this is where we get into gender transformative approaches. So gender transformative approaches are a set of participatory approaches that engage women and men and other intersectional identities in raising their capacities to recognize and interrogate structures that reproduce gender inequality. With respect to this global initiative, our role is to facilitate stock-taking of the norms, perceptions, and behaviors that limit or favor women's de facto rights, tenure security, and women's access to land and resources. We have begun this process through the social legal analysis. The next step is stock-taking gender transformative approaches active at the project level in our 7 countries, develop gender analysis tools for the field, co-designed within the project context, and we hope with some of the panelists sitting here today, to assess gendered norms, perceptions, constraints, and opportunities, which are influencing project outcomes. Then we will facilitate a dialogic reflexive process at the project level, and finally socialize the tools with the partners and learning countries for a global uptake. So thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thanks very much, Emily. I have a few questions, but I think what we'll do is we'll move on now to Esther, who has actually joined you there in Nairobi. And then after that, we're already getting some really good questions from the audience. So I'll go to those, and then maybe we'll have some time for a few more follow-up questions perhaps from myself and others. So with that, I would like to now again introduce Esther Mwaru Mwiru, who is the Global Women's Land Rights Manager for the International Land Coalition. Unfortunately, Esther was going to join us here, but was not able to make it, but had the good fortune to join Emily in Nairobi. So over to you, Esther.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, everyone. I am delighted to be part of this panel. I feel like I have almost very little to say because I do agree with almost all the things that the panelists who have talked have said. And I want to emphasize what the first panelist said and what the two panelists who've spoken after him talked about. The secure women-led rights is so important if we are committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We will not be able to do that until we've ensured that women across all the IFAD have their land secure. It is also a fundamental human right. And I think that the development world must be able to push these facts to conclusion and make sure that land rights become a fundamental human right that governments all over the world start to ensure that they are acknowledged, but also they are enshrined. Now, what we have realized is that it is not just a fundamental human right or nothing, but secure women-led rights is so important to guarantee peace and security. It is so important to ensure that we have health and sustainable food systems. Secure women-led rights also ensures that women and girls have eliminated the possibility for violence against them. And we also do know, and that is why this conference is so important, is secure women's land rights are so important to ensure that we are having the escalating climate crisis and the recurrent disasters. So at the International Land Coalition, this been our area of work, but we've been able to prioritize women's land rights, knowing that how fundamental this is important. And in the last strategy that was 2016-2020, we did two things. We ensured that all our networks, and we are a network of over 350 members all over the world, that they prioritized one, gender justice, but also they were able to make sure they invested in women's land rights. And I would say two things that were very critical in this strategy that it's adding, is that we were able to ensure that women groups had their voice and agency, that together they were able to act as a collective and being able to influence local policies, regional policies, and global policies. But they were also able to have resources and power that help them to do actions on the ground. This includes creating enough awareness among groups on what kind of advocacy they should take ahead to be able to address and push for their secure women's land rights. But this has not been enough. And this has been surfaced by the new research that the International Land Coalition launched this year. The Land Inequality and Even Ground report that has shown that the top 10% of the rural population controls the 60% of world agricultural land, and that the 50% that is below of the rural population controls just 3%. I mean, it is unacceptable. We also have realized that the largest 1% of farms operate 70% of the farmland in their value and in the numbers, and that 84% of the farms for the rest of the other privileged are smaller than 2 acres. It's unacceptable. But we do have opportunities moving forward to change this norm. We do know, for example, that ILC now has a very bold strategy that has just been finalized, the 2021-2030 organizational strategy, and it's going to be prioritizing people's organization as the focus of its investment. But in that, we are also prioritizing women's land rights. We are also part of the global Stand for Halal campaign, and we are going to be implementing this campaign. ILC is leading in 4 countries where resources have been availed. And the idea is to bridge the gap between the policy and the practice. Because we do know that many of all these countries have formidable policies, institutional frameworks. They do have legal framework, but unfortunately the practice doesn't tell it all. And that's why we are investing there. But as a world, we are coming out of the generation equality process. And I proudly can say that the International Land Coalition managed to lead members of the International Land Coalition and other global actors to develop what we call the Women's Land Rights Collective Commitment. And we have committed ourselves in the next 5 years to make sure that the generation equality plans not only uphold women's land rights, but advance women's land rights. With ourselves committing to ensure that 100 million rural women's land is going to be guaranteed in the next 5 years. And so we are saying, what should we do to advance women's land rights? First of all, we need to make sure we are tracking progress. Institutional data is not important enough, but we would like the acceptance of community-driven data, and particularly data by the women. We want to make sure resource goes to the women so that they can strengthen their capacity to drive change. We are also saying that the integration of the challenges of climate crisis is now more important than ever. So I'm happy to contribute more, Harold, just to give a chance for the participants to also contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you very much. I think what's been interesting with the 3 panelists is that we've moved from a particular project in one country to looking at what can be done as sharing between different countries, experiences, gathering that into a global campaign of action. I think that's important. And even with Esther, we've moved from, how do we give agency and voice to local women to effectively influence a global agenda. So thank you very much for that. Esther, we'll come back and certainly ask you more questions. As I said, there are a few questions here already being posted, but I would now like to just quickly ask the audience here if you have any questions before I go to the ones online. And we have one question here from the audience that I happen to know, but please introduce yourself.
Hi. I'm not sure if it works. Yeah, it works? Fantastic. No. Okay. I'm Chiara Soletti from the Italian Climate Network. I'm also, can you hear? Yeah, sorry. I'm a bit confused from the audio system. I'm Chiara Soletti from the Italian Climate Network, but I'm also representing the group that is an animal welfare organization and that has a strong interest also in the impact of working animals and therefore land rights for women. I was wondering if, first of all, thanks to all the speakers. Their efforts and their action is absolutely impressive. And I'm so pleased to see that there is someone so committed to women's rights in general and specifically land rights. I was wondering if in their experience, they ever had any consideration, for example, on indigenous women's rights to access to resources and what is supposed to be their traditional territories. So I don't know if you ever had the experiences in your country about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that question, Chiara. We'll take a few questions. So the first one now we've received on how indigenous women's land rights, territorial rights, and how can that be grappled with. I'm going to look because I think there's a few other questions that might relate to that. And I'm just going to look online and see if I can pick a few of these and see how we can then ask our audience to handle them. In fact, the first question, I'll invite the panelists to answer. All of you can answer, but I'm going to ask Esther particularly to focus on this question. And I'd like to take another question and perhaps direct it to Emily and ask you about, what about direct titling for women-headed households? And what about households with more than one wife? And the question has been asked by Judith Appleton. So I'm directing that question to Emily, and then I would like to direct a question to Tabassum. So you each have a question, and then I'll give you a chance to respond. And this question, Tabassum, is from Tapan Kantide, and they ask, after the river or coastal char erosion, the new place where the people are resettled is being built. Will it not be affected by erosion again in the next few decades? This is one of the major sustainability questions, and how do you deal with that? So those are the three questions. Since the first question was asked by Chiara, Esther, would you like to take that first question? And I hope that you heard it. If you didn't, I can repeat.
Can I try to say what I understood?
Yes,
think
please.
what the participant asked is how our experiences in advancing the women's land rights for indigenous women, and what is our view about it. That was my understanding and my interpretation of the question. Am I right, Ara?
That's correct.
Okay, fantastic. So I just want to say how grateful I am to hear this question. The last 2 years, International Art Coalition has been actually chasing a lot of fathers to say, please invest specifically on the secure women's land rights for the indigenous women, for women living in pastoralist communities, and for women who are living in rural areas, because these 3 categories of women is such a big challenge. But what our experience has been with addressing the secure land rights for indigenous women is making sure that the countries at the national level do have legal processes or policy frameworks that address these issues. For example, I'll tell you, I come from Kenya, and with a lot of other actors, the International Land Coalition has been supporting local organizations to push for the enactment of a Community Land Act. And we have been able to help indigenous women to organize themselves to understand crystal clear what this Community Land Act means for them, but being able to actually communicate and influence the government to make sure that its implementation puts the voice of the indigenous women at the local level. So for example, just to be very clear on the example, in Kenya we have had a lot of group lunches, and all these group lunches were dominated by men leadership. So what we did as a way of making sure the Community Land Act supported women's capacity is to be able to map all the women, the adult women in those community lunches, and being able to put them in the data so that they are also part of the registration of the members of the community ranch as we transit from the community ranches to the community land act. But also making sure, because we have a very strong two-that gender rule in the country, that we cannot have any leadership without the positioning of the women. Making sure that the women understand this two-that gender rule exists, and making sure that they seek position to be part of the running or the leadership of these community ranches. And it's working very, very effectively.
Thanks very much, Esther. I'm mindful of the time, and we are running a bit short on time. So Emily, very briefly.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Harold, I didn't hear my question.
Okay, let me just see it again. The question is, what about direct titling for women-headed households? And what about households with more than one wife? What do we do in that situation?
In the couple minutes I have left, I guess from this project perspective, what we're doing now is looking across the country context and analyzing what is happening in each country. And then the process from there is to do the gender analysis and ask what the social norms are around those practices. So it's not prescriptive, but it is meant to be socially embedded, but still towards the eye of gender transformation. So yes, if there are individual titles there, then certainly female heads of household are included within that. And I'm sorry, the second question was about joint women. Now that varies across country, and particularly when you have ethno-states like in the Gambia, and also when you bring in religion. So it's culturally and contextually specific. Sorry, let me skip there and allow you to ask the next.
Thanks, Emily. Sorry for that. Tabassum, are you still there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Did you get the question that we asked you?
I did. Can I go ahead?
Yes, very briefly, Tabassum.
Yeah, before I go to my question, Harold, just to add to what Emily said with regards to land titles and multiple wives. So in Bangladesh, a condition of land titling is that if the husband divorces, his part of the share goes in the name of the woman. And if he wants multiple marriages, he will need consent of the first wife, and then his 50% share would be further divided into 2 equal shares between himself and his second wife. So as you can imagine, divorce rates have dropped, polygamy has dropped, and obviously domestic violence and GBV has also dropped significantly as a result of these land titling initiative under our CDSP project. Now, to answer Mr. Tapun Kanti's question, yes, unfortunately, families living in climatically vulnerable areas prone to erosions have to move and resettle multiple times, as I have mentioned in my previous comments, multiple times in their lives. But that does not stop us and should not stop us from helping them to build their livelihoods and lives. So we continue to do that and ensure their security of livelihoods and land tenure. At the same time, this project is much more, has other aspects that includes protecting the land. So we are building dikes and embankments and other infrastructure that can help protect the area. So this project that we have is a combination of both these soft interventions of building life skills, as well as the hard infrastructure components that we try to protect the land, the soil, the water from salinity, and of course, erosion, as you have mentioned. Thanks, Harold. Over to you. I hope that was enough.
Thank you very much, Tabassum. I think it's a complex question. What I've learned as well is there are various studies being done, morphological studies to better predict the erosion and movements. But what we've also found that many of the areas are stabilizing, and then there are areas even where there might be still at risk that within a short space of time, people are moving out of poverty, and that takes them onto another trajectory. So even if it is a risk of the soils moving, there is that opportunity. I'm going to take another round in the audience. If there are any questions here, otherwise we still have quite a few coming online. Yes, please. I'm going to have to put this on again.
My name is Jacinda Silakan from Kenya. I represent Sangida Foundation, which is an organization for women and girls with disabilities and caregivers among the pastoralists, the communities. I just came in and I saw that you were talking about land, and land among the women pastoralist communities is very evasive. Women are not allowed to own land, and yet we are the managers of land and all the resources that are there in the community. So it is even worse when it is women with disabilities, because then we are even known as, we have a curse, it's a stigma, we are bad omen. So what we are doing as an organization.
You're coming to your question.
Sorry.
Just if you could
so it's
just ask a question.
It's a comment that
I see.
We as women with the disabilities have come up also to talk about conversations about land, because it's very crucial to us. And what we are doing is having like empowerment programs for ourselves so that we are on the same table with men. It's very difficult. And for us in this forum, I would like us to talk more about how we can involve women, especially with disabilities, when it comes to land issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. We don't have a question, but we'll see if the panelists have anything to say. I can say on the part of IFAD, we have a particular focus on disability, and our gender team is involved in that particular initiative. Unfortunately, we won't have time today, but we can share some of that information with you after the session. But thank you very much. We agree with you. I agree with you. It's an important issue that we should not ignore. So I'm going to take another question. And João, is João still there with us? I think he's not. He got up very early this morning.
I'm here.
Okay, João, you're still there. So let me share a question with you that was posted online to us. João, you mentioned several policy solutions for improving insecurity of land rights of women. Have you personally found a combination of interventions to be effective? Or let's say from your research, have you found a combination of interventions to be effective? If so, which ones together? Over to you.
That's actually a great question. And I think that's where the frontier of research is at the moment. What we are trying to do now is realizing that strengthening the land rights of women might just be one piece of the puzzle. Women farmers face multiple constraints. So think about land rights. So imagine that you give me a land title, and imagine that it's more than a piece of paper. It actually protects. I feel more secure in terms of my ownership of the land. So that might increase my incentives to invest in the land. But in order to do that, I need to have liquidity, or I need to have the correct information about the best farming practices to invest, or I might need to have access to markets. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that if we don't also tackle these other constraints that women in particular face, you might go a long way with land titling, but probably not as far as we would like. So in Uganda, remember the study I presented in Uganda where we gave land titles to women? What we are now doing, we already did, we cross-cut that land title intervention with a cash grant intervention. Okay, so we gave a cash grant to female farmers that receive a land title, as well as female farmers that did not receive a land title. They were part of the comparison group. And what we're going to be doing next, we'll go back to the field when we can, and we'll be collecting surveys and try to understand the extent to which relaxing liquidity constraints and strengthening women's land rights complement each other. Another example, in Mozambique, we are working on a new land registration program, and impact evaluation there. And what we found is that we conduct a poll in the communities, and what we found is that the majority of both men and women, they underestimate the level of support that exists in the community on whether women should own land. So the magnitude of the underestimation is very large. So we are thinking now is prior the land registration program arrives to the field and households are asked which names go on the title, we would like to go there and correct these beliefs, provide information about the true level of support in the community. Because if one of the reasons that, say, men shy away from sharing land rights in their lives is because they fear some perhaps stigma or ostracization from violating the social norm, perhaps by telling them that, look, there are many more men like you in your community that support women's land rights. And we want to see how that affects their land titling decisions. So in this case, you might need to also work on reshaping social norms in order for a land title intervention to be to achieve its full potential.
Great, thanks, Joao. We are running out of time now. We are coming to the end of this session. Before we finalize and give a very few closing last words to the panelists, I just want to see, is the Mentimeter, can we post the Mentimeter and see if there is anything that we can see from there with the, in terms of the, so the question was asked, what actions would you like to see happening in the next year? I'm just seeing if I can see here. What jumps out to me, women's empowerment, peace, resilience, recognition of women, I think in every level, and then the rest I'm afraid I can't see, but I think those are the key ones. It's small for me. But you can see on the audience, you can see on the screen what the audience has said. So that we are coming to the end of the session. I would like to thank the panelists. I think some of the takeaways that I can take from this is it really is a combination of actions that need to be taken. We've learned that securing women's land rights is key for climate change adaptation. We need to measure the impact of that. It's a combination of actions from the legal framework, ensuring that there is a robust legal framework that will recognize women's land rights. But then once you've got that, it's also about registering, recognizing their rights, co-spousal registration, and then ensuring that women have a voice, both at the community level, but also in terms of at a higher level of policy making, at a national level, and even in terms of at the global level, ensuring that actions are taken in changing cultural norms, involving men and leaders in that. So again, it's a combination of actions, I think. I'm afraid we have to wrap up now. So I would like to thank the panelists for your time. Thank you very much for the questions from the audience, both online and here in the room, and thank you for the session.